Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club, where Vivian Dudro, Joseph Pearce, and I, Father Fessio, will begin discussing this book, Faith and Reason, subtitled Philosophers Explain Their Turn to Catholicism. And this is an unusual kind of book for us to discuss, and so I am anticipating that the discussion will be unusual too, because it's not about faith and reason as some kind of abstract reflection. It's about people with a philosophic bent who actually are professional philosophers who have either become Catholic or come back to the faith. And what I find interesting, and one reason we published the book, is that while these stories, each of them is personal and quite inspiring and interesting, there's a common theme here that when you dedicate your life to the search for truth, many people like these find that it leads to the Catholic Church. So while I find it interesting reading, because bios are interesting, and I think heaven will be interesting, partly because of that, I kind of wonder about that, because in the presence of God, we may forget the attention of everybody else, but I'm hoping that we get to know each other better and all our billions and billions of co-residents. But in this, you see kind of incarnated or embodied the truths of the Catholic faith and why they make a difference in one's life. So with that, let's get started.
I would like to say, Father, first I'd like to thank Ignatius for publishing this, because I do think, just on the strength of reading the first chapters, which is as far as we've agreed to read, that this is an important book, not because not just an abstract outline of faith and reason, and because it's the conversion stories, actually, of 10, I think it's 10, so philosophers. And I think that sort of adding, should we say, the personal dimension to objective question makes it much more accessible to those of us that are untrained philosophers and are maybe a little bit find it a little bit awkward living in the abstract. So this, that's the point, concretizes the abstract by setting it within the definitive stories of these individual philosophers' quest truth, and they're coming to the faith. And I'm grateful to Ignatius Press bringing this out on the strength of the first two chapters, the first two testimonies. It's a great book.
How shall we begin? We already began, but I mean,
we have page 19 first, so I'll bow to anybody who's preferred.
You have something on page 19?
Yeah, but I'll bow before anybody who has anything earlier than that.
Well, in the foreword by Francis Beckwith, who is a professor of philosophy, which most of these men are, I love his last line, which is, so if your aim is to be rational, you must take faith seriously. And I would say that the opposite is also true, that if you aim to be faithful through the whole course of your life, you better take your reasoning seriously too. Because it's a constant process of, if God is so above us and clouded in mystery, then this is going to be a lifelong process, in fact, an eternal process of entering into the mystery of God. So there's always more to be thinking about. And that is something to be taken seriously, maybe not too seriously, as G.K. Chesterton warns us, but nevertheless.
Well, no, Chesterton was all in favor of taking reason seriously.
He was just not in favor of us taking ourselves too seriously.
Yes, or reducing life to reason. As he said, insanity is not a defect of reason, it's an excess of reason. That is, not allowing other factors of the heart to be part of your reflection,
Right. And so then with the opening of the introduction, it's the perfect follow-on to this question of how these two things work together, because the first question, Tertullian's famous, what indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem?
Yes.
What indeed?
And he's an interesting figure because he actually, there are texts from Tertullian which are in the Office of Readings for the official prayer of the Catholic Church, the Divine Office, that is the hours. But Tertullian, who wrote a very famous treatise against heretics, became a heretic himself. He left the church. He was a rigorist.
What does that mean, Father?
Well, what it means is when he asked the question, what does Jerusalem have to do with Athens? He, the roots of his heretical position were already there, that if you don't understand how the revelation of the Old Testament and through Jesus the New incorporates and also can be enlightened, illuminated by Hellenism, by the Greeks, by their philosophy, by Athens, then you're not Catholic. I mean, Catholic is Athens and Greece, and eventually Rome as well.
So you're saying that by his asking the question, he already revealed that there was something missing in his understanding, or?
Yes, by asking that question, as if philosophy has no place in our faith because we now have revelation, that is a fundamental error.
Got it. So he was a rigorist in terms of revelation only.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that for those of us who...
I mean, he was sort of the precursor of sola fides, faith alone, I mean, what does faith alone mean? Faith has got to have something to do with the intellect. And it has to do with the intellect. It has to do with our reflection, our reason on our experience. So how can you have faith without reason? I mean, doesn't make any sense.
I was also thinking that he's also a prefiguring of Scriptura, right? If everything to know is revealed in Scripture, then so the Scriptures enough. Right? It's just know the Bible, and you'll know all you need to know. In other words, you don't need to know Athens. You don't need to know the philosophical approach to these. I see philosophy can help us to understand Scripture. That's necessary. So the Scriptura way of. Problem with that, of course, it invariably becomes subject.
Well, even to read the Bible, you have to know grammar and vocabulary and language. I mean, so you can't have a faith without reason. I mean, that's I would say unreasonable.
So as the introduction progresses, he explains that, the majority of professional philosophers in the universities are self-described atheists. And so, he realizes he's talking about, a rare breed of professional philosopher who becomes a man of faith. But what I found interesting was a statement on page 19 where he says, also worthy of consideration is the relative absence of a considered Catholic exodus, meaning the people who come to the church by way of the hard work of thinking about things. All right, maybe there are a few, but they're there. What you don't see is people leaving the church because they seriously considered the claims of the church. Often they leave for all kinds of reasons other than that they really did find that the claims of the church were demonstrably false, you know?
Yeah, I have that sentence highlighted as well, but I've also got highlighted beneath it. So basically, people don't tend to lapse from the because of a considered understanding of the truths of the faith. But he says further down here, much more commonly, one will find fallen away Catholics who were raised in nominally religious homes, i.e., in which Catholic faith was simply a matter of routine, and who had either superficial or an irrationally dogmatic religious education. That many of these lose their Catholic faith is not surprising, even though it is deeply lamentable. For individuals like these, Catholicism seems to have never had genuine rational appeal. The seed of faith appears to have only ever grown shallow roots. In stark contrast, finds a great many converts to Catholicism whose allegiance was a hard one, full of mind against a rationally settled former conclusion. So I think this answers what you were saying earlier, Father, about the necessity of faith and reason being inexorably bonded. That if you just have faith on the basis of routine or a shallow understanding or sola scriptura, it's very easily rooted and lost because it has no rational roots.
Yes, the path of conversion from reason to faith is a one-way street. As you said and Vivian said, and as the introduction stated, there are very few instances of those who, by careful reflection and reading and assessing all the data, leave the Catholic Church. There are other reasons, and often they're moral reasons, because along with Catholic dogma, there's Catholic moral teaching, which imposes quite serious demands on the believer. Then another reason, Rod Dreher is an example here, is of someone who leaves the Catholic Church as an intellectual, I would call him, in a certain degree, but because of the corruption of the church, and he doesn't go to atheism or to Protestantism, he goes to Orthodoxy, that is Eastern Orthodoxy, which is the closest religious communion, if it is a communion, it's fairly dispersed, that maintains most of the teachings of the doctrine of the Catholic Church.
Well, the introduction, as far as I can see, is just Dr. Besong just giving us a summary of what the essays are going to say. So I propose that we actually move on to Edward Faze's essay, chapter 1.
Let us do that.
I just would like to make a footnote to Father's remark about Catholics leaving the church for moral reasons, because the moral demands of the church are high, and sometimes that can appear on the surface as though the person just wants to go live a sinful life, but often what can be down deep is an inability to reconcile themselves with the fact that because they're weak, that's why they need the church. That there can be a kind of hopelessness that sets in to a person who seems to be always battling the same moral weakness, and a fatigue can kind of just set in where they just, okay, forget about it. But it isn't necessarily that they've rejected, like, who's going to say that getting drunk every night and beating your wife is a good idea? Like, a man doesn't leave the church because that's what he wants to keep doing, but a man will often leave the church because he's given up hope that he can be a better man, even with the church. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. So, we need compassion and to continue to exhort and encourage those who feel weak and actually need the church, and the very thing they need is the thing that they're turning away from.
We're back now for a slight pause to try and reconnect our friend Joseph Pearce, who has the luxury of living in a wonderful rural area, but has the consequence of a inadequate internet connection. And I think that the former outweighs the latter, in importance in one's life. But I forget where we were.
Well, I was actually going to suggest that I go back on one I said, because I did want to actually refer to the final paragraph of the introduction on page 25, if I may. Can I just read that and comment on it?
Surely.
Yes.
Surely.
Okay. In each of these essays, the attentive reader will find a fully human story. For as human, we are rational beings, but we are not disembodied intellects. We are driven by reason, but not by reason alone. Rational considerations captured the attention of our contributors, but their intellects were actuated by more than what's appropriate subject, cross-examination and scrutiny. In other words, the contributions contained herein are not merely a collection of arguments for Catholicism, they are stories of grace. And I think that's very important, because I know in my own case, and I'm not a philosopher, but I was absolutely convinced for several years from my own reception into the church that my process of conversion was entirely and solely rational. And it was only several years after my reception to the church that I realized there was a healing process going on simultaneously, of which I was unaware at the time, because I was unaware of how much healing I needed until I saw things in retrospect. So, of course, the healing was the grace. And all the stories require not just unassisted reason, but supernatural grace. And I'm really pleased in that final paragraph that point was made.
Yes.
I think the first chapter here by Edward Feser is a beautiful example of that, how the grace was so operative. And I do think, maybe this is a prejudice, but I do think that traditional people have a better sense of humor than progressives. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but in my long life, it seems to have been confirmed by my experience. But this chapter is an example of someone who was seriously looking for the truth, and yet looking back, seeing how humorous it was. In the very first page of 27, he talks about as a teacher, trying to present both sides. The last sentence in the paragraph, making the explanation as convincing as I could for pedagogical purposes, I inadvertently converted myself. He was an atheist, but he wanted to try and make the Christian position interesting. So he read up on it and tried to make the arguments, and he converted himself.
Well, his motivation, I think, is a little bit more than making it interesting. That was part of it for sure, but I think he also says somewhere that he thought it was only fair to try to find good reasons for why serious people believe as they do, even when what they believe doesn't make sense to you. He thought that was like a fair-minded thing to do, right? To let me see if I can come up with reasons for why someone would believe this. Well, that's kind of a risky thing to do, right? Because
he's being an honest philosopher, and that's actually very unusual. He actually wants to look at both sides of the argument objectively, and that's in itself unusual. So there's that genuine, authentic objectivity, but also in the pragmatism. He talks about later on, he wants to make the class interesting, right? Just holding up St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways as a sort of straw man shoot down, right? Everybody's yawning. So, this is what we expected, and obviously Christians are dumb. And he thought, I've got to make the class interesting. Let's actually try to make the case. And of course, he was honest enough to know Thomas was quite an idiot. Surely he must have thought a bit more deeply than this straw man caricature or parody or stereotype. So he's honest and pragmatic, and the two came together in this catalytic way.
And humble, because for him to look at an Aquinas and realize, look, we're dealing with a serious intellect here. It can't be that his reasons are as simplistic and sloppy as the straw man, as you described it, Joseph, that I find in textbooks. There's got to be more to this than this, and what is that? But that takes humility to recognize the greatness in another soul. in order to want to find out why that such a person would believe as he does, you know?
Yeah. Let me jump forward. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Joseph.
I said also it does take humility. It also takes practical application of the objective principles he's supposed to be following as a philosopher. So it also shows honest integrity as well as humility.
That's right. It does.
I want to jump forward and then a little backwards. On page 32, about a third of the way up from the bottom, as a teacher, he said, "My view was that the most interesting way to teach a philosophy class, especially for novices in the subject, was to present a philosophical dispute as something like an intellectual street fight."
Yeah.
I like that. But then on page 30, in the middle of the page there, just above it, he says, "The overarching theme for me was the idea that Christianity requires an irrational faith commitment." And so he liked this epigram from Nietzsche, which he quotes, "A very popular error, having the courage of one's convictions. Rather, it is a matter of having the courage for an attack on one's convictions." So he saw that as Nietzsche's argument and his own argument against Christianity. You people have to have the courage to attack your convictions. But then he realized, bottom of the page, the irony is that the very sentiment that led me to this conclusion would eventually lead me away from it. For I would come to do something that few people who thrilled in Nietzsche's epigram ever seemed to. I applied it to atheism itself and to my skeptical assumption about Catholicism. That is to say, Nietzsche's talking about how Christians should have the courage to challenge their convictions. And Fessio says, well, actually, atheists should have that courage too.
That's
and therefore
right.
I decided to challenge them and see what happened.
So now we see a third virtue required here. You need humility, you need integrity, and you need courage. And
I would say sorry, please. Sorry.
I was just going to say, and Phaser, we've worked with him on some other books. He is kind of a street fighter sort of guy. He has those three virtues in abundance. And so his personality really leaps off the pages here. Like he really is this kind of man.
Yeah, and what I love about it, first of all, I love that epigram by Nietzsche. That's Nietzsche best. But what we find, atheists, there are two types of atheists. There are the honest atheists who are authentically looking for the truth. And there are the dishonest atheists who don't want God to exist. And they're the vast majority, in fact. That's, once you scrape the surface, they get abusive, right? And that's the way you tell the difference. Do you actually want a genuine, rational, honest argument, or do you just want to beat over the head with the handful of ideas you have, And so that's the whole point, is most atheists are not this sort of honest atheist that Edward Phaser was. They don't want God to exist, and they're going to use whatever arguments they can to beat God into submission.
Well, good luck with that.
Yeah. So he had the courage to challenge his own atheist convictions, and he says on page 31, after being an atheist for about 10 years, what was it that began to lead him to question his own convictions? He says, about a fourth of the way down, first, arguments convinced me that none of the existing attempts to explain the human mind in materialist terms could work. That is, trying to explain thought and the mind as mere motions of atoms in the brain doesn't work. Second, arguments from the logician convinced me that attempts to explain language and meaning in materialist terms also fail. And third, that mathematical physics tells us little about the nature of matter beyond its abstract structure. So basically he tried to follow out the premises of materialist philosophers about mind, language, and matter. And he said, if you try to follow them out, they lead to absurd conclusions. And that began to kind of crack his shell, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And that paragraph ends, Father, with I think a good sentence. It, as in atheism, it was as riddled with difficulties, unanswered questions, and dogmatic assumptions as atheists take theism to be. And he said that softened me up for the next big revelation, which was that theism, by contrast, was in fact much more philosophically sophisticated and worked out than I had supposed.
Mm-hmm.
I have something on page 33 for...
Go ahead. I do too, but you go ahead.
Well, I'm just about halfway down there. He says it could turn out it is only unexamined prejudices of your own that have kept you from taking the ideas seriously. Certainly, you will understand the ideas better as a result of having made the effort. And then a couple lines further down, how might an Aquinas or is it Leibniz or not Leibniz, Father? Leibniz?
Leibniz, EI is I in German.
How might Aquinas or Leibniz respond to the various objections which seem so obvious and devastating? So what I've written in the margin here is great conversation. It's that distinction between the great books taking a standalone, ossified objects and the great conversation. Because if you've got to allow Aquinas to respond to Nietzsche. And the only way you do that, of course, is take people that understand Aquinas and Thomists that can actually respond to Nietzsche's arguments. That's conversation. If you just take the books as ossified individual things in chronological order, then the most modern idea always has the last word, and that's not a conversation, right? So that's what we're saying here. You've got to allow Aquinas to respond to atheism himself, to these modern philosophies himself.
And I found the line that I was alluding to earlier, just above there, Joseph, is this also 33. You cannot be confident that you've given an idea a fair hearing until you make a serious effort to understand how a rational person could find it plausible. And so here he is engaging the thoughts of people like Aquinas and Leibniz and others and saying, well, I'm going to give them the credit for being rational men, serious men, and I need to make a serious effort to understand what they really have to say, not just go by what their detractors say that they say.
I would say, well, this is beautiful writing, by the way. That's a beautiful sentence. It reminds me of C.S. Lewis. Edward Fays puts abstract arguments and abstract things very concretely, very succinctly, and also very beautifully. And that's an unusual gift. And he certainly had sentences such as that.
Yes, and I underline that sentence too, Vivian. And I'm impressed by thinkers and writers who can do this. I think of Thomas Aquinas, for example, who every question in the Summa, he presents arguments for it and against it by very, competent people, whether it's Augustine or Plotinus or whoever it might be, and then he responds with his answer. I found that in C.S. Lewis. I found that in Chesterton and Balthasar, and I do not find it in myself. It's hard for me to understand how other people come to their conclusions to think. But I think we have to make the effort to give a fair hearing to others' ideas, make a serious effort to understand how a rational person can find it plausible. But unfortunately, if we look at not the intellectual world, but the political world, I mean, I can't understand how someone can deny the fact that the result of a conception in a human being is a human being. I don't, and they won't, politically, they won't even address it. But I can't understand how someone can really think that you can somehow choose your own sex or gender or not know that we are biologically binary, So I try, but I'm incapable so far of achieving that sense of plausibility.
I think when it comes to the political sphere, though, we're not dealing anymore with pure thinking, right?
Or the search for truth.
We're dealing with bargaining over power. And so what people will say and do to get power, to keep power, may have absolutely nothing to do with what they really think. They may actually leave what they really think outside the door in order to get whatever it is they think they want to have in this power struggle.
This is merely Nietzscheanism in practice, right? I mean, Nietzsche is ultimately a relativist who thinks it's about self-empowerment. So if it's about self-empowerment, it's not about objective truth, which doesn't exist. It's about getting what you want. And so, there's no rational, objective philosophical engagement with people that start off with that supposition. I want the right to do what I want, and that includes killing my own child, and you have no right to stop me, and I'm going to say whatever's necessary to win an argument in order to achieve that end.
And a politician who may actually think that your behavior is abhorrent, if he goes like this, puts his finger in the wind and says, well, but there are a lot of people who want to kill their kids, so I need to stay in power by making them happy, by letting them do what they want. It may not have anything to do with what the person actually really thinks about the behavior. So it's best, when we're discussing philosophy as we are, it's best to keep the political realm out of it, because politics is just going to corrupt any conversation about objective truth that you could possibly have.
Very good.
But here on page 35, we see that, in short, he's decided, I'm taking Aquinas seriously. He's a serious man. He's an intelligent man. I'm going to really look into it, not just what his detractors say he says in these dumb textbooks. And what does he find? In short, no one who has actually studied Aquinas' natural theology could think that he believes the things commonly attributed to him, or that the standard objections have any force at all. But here's a man who took the time to read Aquinas carefully himself. And quite frankly, a lot of people they're either lazy, or they don't have the time, or they don't have the inclination. It's just easier to read what somebody else says, someone says, and go and run with it. And I think we owe it.
After that paragraph, this re-examination of Aquinas had two immediate effects on me. First, enabled me to improve my teaching, so a practical, pragmatic consequence. But then, second, it hammered home lesson that academic philosophers, even when speaking on philosophical topics, often don't know what they are talking about. They're as prejudiced, ignorance, and circular reasoning as anyone else.
And I might add that the same goes for academic theologians.
And literary critics.
I mean,
exactly.
Just because someone's got a PhD doesn't impress me.
Amen. Amen.
But I will say, though, that because history is cumulative, and therefore the conversation we want to enter into, it gets larger and larger and larger. It gets more data there, that there is a value to people who do summarize or anthologize or abridge what's gone before and do it fairly. Like we discussed the book, The City of God by St. Augustine.
Right.
That, to me, once we can if we can verify that abridgment is accurate and is true to what Augustine actually wrote and said, then we can rely upon it. But
I agree 100%. And of course, the things he had read about Aquinas previously were written by people debunking Aquinas. Right? So he had to free himself from whatever the baked-in prejudices in those works might be. He had to go read Aquinas himself. But I agree with you. I don't have time to read Aquinas. I'm never in my entire life going to read the entire Summa or the entire anything. I absolutely depend on trustworthy, faithful practitioners
which is why philosophy is important, because at least it shows us and teaches us how to judge whether someone is being honest and whether they have integrity, or whether it's the product of prejudice or arrogance. And the bottom of that paragraph on page 36, he doesn't list it as number 3, but the third consequence is, what else have they gotten wrong? I ask myself. So in other words, they're as arrogant about being, as ignorant about this, about Aquinas, then what else? What else are they arrogant, ignorant, and wrong about? And so it opened up the floodgates for him to become healthily objective and skeptical about academic philosophy.
Yes. As on the bottom of 37, it increasingly dawned on me that atheism, no less than theism, could be motivated by wishful thinking, special pleading, and otherwise irrational habits of mind, and that theism could be motivated by entirely rational considerations, no less than atheism could be.
This is a fair mind.
Yeah,
fair man of the fair mind.
Yeah, it is a beautiful story of that fair man and a fair mind. And I would make a parenthetical remark here, or a more general remark, that because we have access now, easy access to much more than anyone's ever had, all the writings of the past are available to us. The internet floods us with information, or a proportion of information every day, that one of the most important skills to acquire is being able to discern those people who are reliable reporters of other things and those who are not. Because we none of us can know everything, or even much,
That's right,
a little part of that. But again, that is one reason for a classical education of reading the authors who stood the test of time. And then you have a way of judging the quality of what you read. But even in contemporary circumstances, you have to find people you can trust on the various issues. Now, there's always going to be disagreement among some things, especially political things or historical things. But we want to have good teachers, good leaders. We want to find some wise men if we can. And I think, by the way, Phaser is one like that. When you read his story here, it makes you want to trust him more. We published at least 2 books by him, one in which he actually goes over Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs, and another when he goes over the church's teaching on capital punishment. And if you want to know about that, you want to see the text, you want to see what the church has said, interpretation, it's all there.
And Father, I recently sent to the printer another Ed Phaser book on critical race theory.
Oh, yes.
Which he goes to the critical race theorists themselves. He quotes them faithfully. This is what they really say. This is what they really think. It's a very, very helpful guide for anyone who wants to make sense out of that. What's beautiful about this whole journey of his is on page 40, where he sums up what happened to him. The effect was as visceral as it was cerebral. Rational explanation, pursued consistently, led to the conclusion that there is a single, infinite, eternal, necessary, immutable, immaterial, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, ultimate cause of things. One that, as I learned from Aquinas' arguments in particular, is sustaining everything in existence, including me, right now and at every moment.
Yeah.
And that, as you mentioned before, Joseph, that's grace. That's grace, to get through all of this mind work, but then and me, he cares for me, right?
And I'm going to jump forward to page 51, and people can go jump backward if they want. But on his path, where he began to see the Catholic Church had a lot of claims which seemed credible to him, he asked the question, new paragraph on page 51, but had Catholicism really preserved the teaching of the early church, whole and undefiled? And what was it that convinced him it had? Contraception.
And this is what you want to send to the Vatican. Because I fear that there are too many political creatures going like this.
Yeah.
And not enough men like Ed Phaser. God forgive me if I'm committing some kind of sin of detraction or anything, but we need more men like Ed Fazer in the church. What can I say? Who have the intellectual integrity to hold the line and not just give in to what they think the people want from them or whatever. And it's tough. It's very tough.
Only a relativist does that, right? Again, as Chesterton says, we don't want a church that will move with the world, right? We want a church that will move the world.
I grew up sailing. That's what we would do.
He's been rooted in reason, and that's exactly what Edward Fazer here. He will show how the world is wrong, and how and why the church is right through the application of reason, and that's what we need. We need a rooted objectivity in the church, as we have throughout history. We need all times, and if it's lacking any time, it has negative, destructive consequences, which of course will not prevail, but it will cause a mess, and faith will be lost by people, and harm will be done, and then that will still be there at the end of the day, rising from the dead. But
Well, yes, he basically in the last page of the chapter 52, talking about Paul VI on contraception. In his person, the Catholic Church did exactly what you would expect her to do if she was what she claimed to be. Under great pressure, she held fast to the deposit of faith, even when everyone else was doing the opposite.
Yep.
This utter, intransigent insistence on doctrinal consistency, even in the face of massive countervailing cultural pressures, spoke to the truth and rationality of the Catholic Church.
Yep. And I appreciate, though, that even after this intellectual understanding and grace-filled understanding, what does he say on 51? But the flesh is weak, and I dithered. It's one thing to have the intellectual honesty to see the truth for what it is.
Yeah.
Not because someone says so, but because it just is, simply. And the church has been so good at this over all these centuries. It's another thing now to embrace it, to live by it with grace, to stumble and fall, to keep going. I mean, it's hard. And I appreciated his self-honesty here about that it's hard. And that, but that doesn't mean the church should give way. This is what, we just have to pray so hard for the hierarchy, that they understand that this beautiful thing that the church has given to the world, it's a hard thing, but a lot of good things in life are hard. Don't take it away, because now we don't know where, you've taken away the compass and we don't know where we're going.
Amen. Let us, for next session, read, if we can, up to and including chapter 5 by Peter Kraft. We may not cover it all, but let's keep ahead of ourselves a bit. So chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. And with that, we'll bid you farewell, and God bless you all, and see you next week.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.